The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Guard Captain Marcus Wellington adjusted his red ceremonial uniform for the 100th time that week. His polished black boots reflected the golden light as he took his position beside the ornate palace gates. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, and never broke their stoic composure. Marcus had served the crown for 15 years, and in all that time, he had witnessed countless attempts to make the guards smile, laugh, or even blink. Children would make funny faces, adults would tell jokes, and occasionally someone would try to engage them in conversation. The protocol was clear: remain motionless, eyes forward, no interaction with the public whatsoever. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something would happen that would test every rule Marcus had sworn to uphold. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, approached the gates with her grandmother. The elderly woman walked slowly, supported by a wooden cane, her weathered hands shaking slightly as she guided her granddaughter closer to where Marcus stood guard. The little girl wore a bright yellow dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the hem, and her dark curls bounced as she walked. "Grandmama, why don't they move?" the child whispered, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity that only children possess. The grandmother smiled softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "They're very important guards, Sophie. They protect the palace and everyone inside it. They have to be very still and very brave." Sophie studied Marcus with wide brown eyes, tilting her head as if trying to solve a puzzle. She noticed something that the hundreds of other visitors had missed that morning. A single tear was rolling down Marcus's cheek, barely visible beneath the shadow of his tall bearskin hat. The trained guard was struggling with news he had received just before his shift began. His own daughter, who lived far away with his ex-wife, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. The doctor said the treatment would be long and difficult, and Marcus felt helpless being so far away, unable to comfort his child when she needed him most. Sophie saw the tear, and her young heart immediately understood that this strong, silent guard was sad about something. Without hesitation, she reached into her small pink purse and pulled out a crumpled tissue and a colorful sticker, shaped like a rainbow. "Grandmama, the guardman is crying," she whispered urgently. The grandmother looked up and noticed what her granddaughter had seen. Her own eyes filled with compassion as she recognized the pain of a parent in distress. Sophie walked closer to Marcus, ignoring the rope barriers and the "do not cross" signs. Her grandmother started to call her back, but something in the moment made her pause. The other tourists began to notice the scene unfolding, some raising their cameras, others watching with curious expressions. "Here, Mr. Guard," Sophie said softly, holding up the tissue toward Marcus. "My mama always says tissues help when we're sad." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Every fiber of his training told him to remain still, to ignore the child, to maintain protocol at all costs. But looking down at this small angel offering comfort to a stranger, he found himself at a crossroads between duty and humanity. The moment stretched like an eternity. Other guards stationed nearby had noticed the interaction, and Marcus could feel their eyes upon him. The tourists had grown quiet, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sophie stood there patiently, her small hand still extended with the tissue, her eyes filled with the kind of pure kindness that exists only in children. Marcus thought about his own daughter, lying in a hospital bed hundreds of miles away, probably scared and wanting her father. He thought about all the times she had offered him comfort when he was sad, just like this little girl was doing now. The weight of his ceremonial sword seemed heavier, his uniform more constraining, as he wrestled with a decision that could cost him his career. The grandmother stepped forward slightly, her voice gentle and understanding. "Sophie means no harm, officer. She just wants to help." In that instant, Marcus made a choice that would ripple through the palace guard for years to come. Slowly, carefully, he moved his white-gloved hand and accepted the tissue from Sophie's small fingers. The crowd gasped audibly as the seemingly statue-like guard bent slightly forward, just enough to whisper 2 words that only Sophie could hear. "Thank you." Sophie beamed with joy, her face lighting up like sunshine after rain. She carefully placed the rainbow sticker on Marcus's white glove before stepping back to her grandmother's side. The elderly woman nodded respectfully at Marcus, understanding passing between them like a silent conversation. As the crowd began to murmur and cameras clicked, Marcus straightened back to attention, the tissue tucked discreetly away and the small rainbow sticker hidden in his palm. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. The rigid soldier who had stood there minutes before was now a man who had remembered that sometimes kindness matters more than rules. The story of Guard Captain Marcus Wellington's moment of humanity would spread throughout the palace within hours, reaching the ears of senior officers and eventually the royal family themselves. But in that moment, all that mattered was a little girl's gesture of compassion and a guard's decision to accept it, proving that even the most disciplined hearts can be moved by unexpected kindness. The news of Marcus's act of kindness traveled through the palace corridors like wildfire. By evening, every guard, servant, and official had heard about the little girl with the rainbow sticker, and the captain who chose compassion over protocol. Some whispered disapproval, others smiled knowingly, but everyone agreed that something significant had happened at the palace gates that day. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been standing guard at the east entrance when she heard the story. A 5-year veteran with an impeccable record, Sarah was known for her unwavering dedication to duty. She had joined the Royal Guard to honor her late father, who had served with distinction for 23 years before retiring. Sarah carried his watch in her pocket during every shift, a constant reminder of the family tradition she was proud to continue. 3 days after Marcus's moment of humanity, Sarah found herself facing her own test of protocol versus compassion. The autumn air was crisp, and the changing leaves created a beautiful backdrop for the steady stream of tourists who came to see the famous guards. Sarah stood perfectly still at her post, her ceremonial rifle held at the precise angle required by regulations. Around noon, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench across from her position. He appeared to be in his 80s, wearing a worn military jacket decorated with several medals. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, he sat with the straight posture of someone who had once worn a uniform with pride. The old man had been watching Sarah for over an hour, not with the casual curiosity of a tourist, but with the focused attention of someone studying a familiar ritual. His weathered hands gripped a walking stick, and occasionally Sarah noticed him wipe his eyes with a handkerchief. As the afternoon wore on, other visitors came and went, but the elderly gentleman remained on his bench. Sarah began to feel concerned. The day was growing colder, and she noticed the man occasionally shiver despite his jacket. More troubling, she observed him struggling to open a small bottle of medication, his arthritic fingers unable to manage the child-proof cap. During a brief changing of the guard ceremony, Sarah learned from her replacement that the old man had been there since early morning. He had spoken to no one, eaten nothing, and seemed to be waiting for something or someone who never came. When Sarah returned to her post an hour later, the elderly veteran was still there, but now he appeared to be in distress. His breathing seemed labored, and the medication bottle had fallen from his hands and rolled several feet away on the cobblestone path. Other tourists walked by without noticing his struggle, focused on photographing the guards or exploring other areas of the palace grounds. Sarah felt her heart race as she watched the old man try unsuccessfully to reach for his medication. Every rule in the guard manual was clear about maintaining position and not abandoning post under any circumstances. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, telling her stories about how soldiers looked out for one another, how duty to humanity sometimes trumped duty to regulations. The elderly man's condition was clearly worsening. His face had grown pale, and he was now leaning heavily on the bench, struggling to catch his breath. Sarah realized that waiting for someone else to help might be too late. She thought about her father, about the values he had taught her, about the oath she had taken to serve and protect. In a moment that would define her career, Sarah made her decision. She stepped away from her ceremonial position and walked quickly toward the struggling veteran. The few tourists present turned to watch in amazement as the previously motionless guard abandoned her post. "Sir, are you all right?" Sarah asked gently, kneeling beside the bench to retrieve the fallen medication bottle. The old man looked up at her with surprise and gratitude. "My heart medicine," he wheezed. "Can't open the blasted thing." Sarah quickly opened the bottle and helped the man take his medication. She then used her radio to call for medical assistance, speaking in calm professional tones while never leaving the veteran's side. As they waited for help to arrive, the old man grasped her hand with surprising strength. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his breathing gradually improving. "You remind me of my daughter." "She was a soldier too, was?" Sarah asked gently. The old man's eyes filled with tears. Lost her in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Today was her birthday. I came here because she always loved watching the changing of the guard when she was little. I thought being here might help me feel close to her again. Sarah felt her own eyes moisten as the pieces came together. This grieving father had spent his daughter's birthday watching the guards, perhaps hoping to connect with memories of happier times. She squeezed his hand gently. "She would be proud of you for coming here today," Sarah said softly, "and I'm honored to stand guard in her memory." When the medical team arrived and confirmed the veteran was stable, they offered to take him to hospital for observation. But the old man insisted he felt much better and just wanted to go home. Before leaving, he pressed something into Sarah's palm. It was a small military insignia, worn smooth by years of handling. "This was hers," he said simply. "I think she would want you to have it." As Sarah watched the elderly father walk away, supported by a palace medic, she realized that breaking protocol had led to something far more meaningful than following rules ever could. She had not only potentially saved a man's life, but had also honored the memory of a fallen soldier and provided comfort to a grieving parent. When her commanding officer arrived to investigate reports of a guard leaving her post, Sarah expected discipline or dismissal. Instead, she found herself facing questions about the incident that would lead to discussions at the highest levels of palace security about the balance between duty and humanity. The ripple effects of compassion continued to spread through the royal guard. Word of both Marcus's and Sarah's acts of kindness had reached the highest levels of command, sparking heated debates in meeting rooms throughout the palace. Some senior officers argued that discipline must be maintained at all costs, while others quietly wondered if perhaps the guards had acted exactly as they should have. Corporal James Mitchell found himself caught in the middle of this growing tension. A third-generation guardsman whose grandfather and father had both served with distinction, James carried the weight of family expectation on his shoulders. At 28, he was younger than most of his peers but had quickly earned respect for his attention to detail and unwavering commitment to protocol. James had heard the stories about Marcus and Sarah, and while part of him admired their courage, another part worried about the precedent being set. He believed deeply in the traditions and discipline that made the Royal Guard legendary around the world. The uniform he wore represented centuries of honor and service, and he took that responsibility seriously. On a busy Saturday morning, James was stationed at the North Gate, where school groups and families often gathered to watch the guards. The weather was perfect for tourism, and the crowds were larger than usual. Children pressed against the barriers trying to get the guards to smile or wave, while parents snapped endless photos of the silent sentinels. Among the crowd, James noticed a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, who stood apart from the others. The child was thin and pale, wearing a hospital bracelet that was visible when he reached up to adjust his baseball cap. Unlike the other children who were laughing and trying to get the guards' attention, this boy simply watched with quiet intensity. The child's mother stood nearby, speaking softly into her phone. James could hear fragments of her conversation, enough to understand they were discussing treatment schedules and doctor appointments. The woman's face showed the strain that comes with caring for a seriously ill child, her eyes carrying a weariness that spoke of long nights in hospital rooms. As the morning progressed, James watched the boy's behavior with growing concern. The child seemed fascinated by the guards, but also increasingly distressed. He would start to approach the barrier, then back away, clearly wanting to interact but afraid or uncertain about something. Finally, the boy worked up the courage to move closer. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began writing something on one of the pages. His mother noticed and walked over, kneeling down to speak with him quietly. James couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw the woman's expression soften as she listened to her son's request. The boy tore out the page from his notebook and approached James's position. With trembling hands, he held up the paper so the guard could see what he had written in careful, childish handwriting. "My name is Tommy. I have leukemia. The guards are my heroes. Can you please just nod so I know you see me?" James felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't a tourist trying to be amusing or testing the guards' discipline. This was a sick child reaching out for a moment of connection, for acknowledgement from someone he looked up to. The simple request carried the weight of a young life facing uncertainty and fear. The boy's mother stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been talking about the Royal Guard for months. It's been his dream to visit here. The doctors aren't sure how many more good days he'll have. James stared straight ahead, his training screaming at him to ignore the situation, to maintain his position and composure. But behind his stoic expression, his heart was breaking. He thought about his own nephew, healthy and full of life, taking every day for granted. Here was a child who might not have the luxury of taking anything for granted, asking for the smallest gesture of recognition. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing something important was happening. Other parents pulled their children closer, and even the most casual tourists seemed to understand they were witnessing something profound. Tommy continued to hold up his sign, his young face hopeful but patient. James closed his eyes for just a moment, thinking about what his grandfather would do. The old man had always said that being a guard meant serving something bigger than yourself, protecting not just buildings or people, but the values that made their society worth protecting. Surely those values included compassion for a sick child. When James opened his eyes, he looked directly at Tommy for the first time. The boy's face lit up with pure joy as their eyes met. Then slowly and deliberately, James gave the smallest possible nod, just enough for Tommy to see. The effect was electric. Tommy's mother gasped and covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. The boy himself seemed to glow with happiness, clutching his notebook to his chest as if James had just given him the greatest gift in the world. "He saw me. He really saw me," Tommy exclaimed to his mother, his voice carrying such genuine delight that several people in the crowd began wiping their eyes. But James wasn't finished. Fighting against every regulation he had memorized, he slowly raised his white-gloved hand to his chest, placed it over his heart, and held it there for 3 seconds before returning to position. It was a salute of sorts, a soldier's acknowledgement of another brave soul fighting their own difficult battle. Tommy understood the gesture immediately. He straightened his thin shoulders and attempted to salute back, his small hand trembling but determined. The crowd erupted in soft applause, not the loud clapping of entertainment, but the respectful recognition of something beautiful and meaningful. As security cameras recorded the entire interaction and supervisors received radio reports of another guard breaking protocol, James felt something he had never experienced in his years of service. Instead of the satisfaction that came from perfect adherence to rules, he felt the deeper fulfillment that comes from using one's position to spread hope and kindness. Tommy and his mother stayed for another hour, the boy now standing taller, more confident, as if James's acknowledgement had given him new strength. When they finally left, Tommy waved goodbye, and for just an instant, James allowed himself a small smile in return. The photograph of that moment would later become one of the most shared images on social media, not because it showed a guard breaking rules, but because it captured the perfect balance between duty and humanity that the Royal Guard was beginning to redefine. The palace was buzzing with an energy that hadn't been felt in decades. 3 separate incidents of guards breaking protocol for acts of compassion had captured international attention, with news outlets around the world running stories about the human side of the Royal Guard. Social media was flooded with photos and videos, each post generating thousands of comments praising the Guard's actions. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was causing significant debate among palace officials. Commander Elizabeth Hartwell, a stern woman with 30 years of military service, found herself at the center of a controversy that was challenging everything she thought she knew about leadership and tradition. Sergeant David Thompson had served under Commander Hartwell for 8 years and had never seen her so conflicted. Known for her by-the-book approach and unwavering adherence to protocol, Hartwell was facing pressure from both sides. Conservative officials demanded stricter discipline and punishment for the guards who had broken rules, while a growing number of voices, including some within the royal family, suggested that perhaps the guards had acted exactly as they should. On a gray Monday morning, David found himself assigned to the most challenging post of all, the main entrance during a state visit from foreign dignitaries. The protocol for such occasions was even stricter than usual, with explicit instructions that guards were to remain absolutely motionless and silent, regardless of any distractions or circumstances. The visiting delegation included the Prime Minister of a small European nation, along with his wife and their teenage daughter. Security was tight, with additional guards, police officers, and Secret Service agents positioned throughout the palace grounds. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed multiple times. As the official ceremonies began inside the palace, David maintained his position outside, watching the carefully orchestrated movements of diplomats and officials. The importance of the day weighed heavily on him, knowing that any breach of protocol could create an international incident and potentially end his career. Around midday, during a break in the official proceedings, the visiting prime minister's daughter wandered outside to explore the palace gardens. The 16-year-old girl seemed overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere inside and was clearly seeking a few moments of fresh air and normalcy. Elena, as David learned her name when her security detail called to her, was struggling with something that became apparent to David's trained eye. The teenager was having what appeared to be a panic attack, her breathing rapid and shallow, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself against a garden wall. The girl's security guard was positioned too far away to notice her distress, focused instead on scanning the perimeter for potential threats. Other officials and guests were inside, leaving Elena alone in her moment of crisis except for David, who watched from his ceremonial post 30 feet away. David recognized the signs immediately. His younger sister had suffered from severe anxiety throughout her teenage years, and he had witnessed countless panic attacks during family gatherings and school events. He knew how frightening and isolating these episodes could be, especially for someone far from home in an unfamiliar environment. Elena slumped against the wall, her face pale and tears beginning to flow. She was clearly trying to control her breathing, but was becoming more distressed as the attack intensified. David could see her looking around desperately for help, but the garden area was temporarily empty except for the two of them. The weight of his training pressed down on David like a physical force. This was a state visit, recorded by security cameras monitored by multiple agencies. Any deviation from protocol could create diplomatic complications, and certainly would result in severe disciplinary action. But watching this frightened teenager suffer alone while he stood frozen by regulations felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about protecting others. Elena's condition was worsening. She was hyperventilating now, her panic attack reaching a dangerous level. David realized that waiting for someone else to help might mean watching a young person collapse from anxiety while he stood by and did nothing. In that crucial moment, David made a decision that would echo through the halls of the palace for years to come. He stepped away from his post and walked quickly toward Elena, his ceremonial sword causing his uniform to rustle with each determined stride. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked gently, approaching slowly so as not to startle her further. Elena looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I can't breathe," she whispered in accented English. "Everything is spinning." David knelt beside her, his years of experience with his sister guiding his actions. "You're having a panic attack. It's scary, but you're safe. Can you try to breathe with me?" He began demonstrating slow, deep breathing exercises, speaking in calm, reassuring tones. "In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Just focus on my voice and follow along." Gradually, Elena's breathing began to slow and deepen. The color started returning to her face and her trembling subsided. David stayed with her, continuing to provide gentle guidance and reassurance until she was fully stable. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I was so scared. The pressure of this trip, being away from home, all the formal events, it just became too much." "I understand," David replied kindly. "My sister goes through the same thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. You're very brave for handling such an important trip at your age." Elena smiled weakly. "Will you get in trouble for helping me?" David considered the question honestly. "Probably, but some things are more important than rules." As if summoned by his words, Commander Hartwell appeared around the corner, having been alerted by security cameras to David's departure from his post. Her face was stern and unreadable as she approached the pair. "Sergeant Thompson," she said formally, "you are out of position during a state visit." David stood at attention, preparing for whatever consequences awaited him. "Yes, ma'am. This young lady was experiencing a medical emergency." Commander Hartwell looked at Elena, who had now fully recovered but was clearly embarrassed by the attention. The commander's expression softened slightly as she recognized the signs of someone who had just experienced significant distress. "Are you feeling better, miss?" Hartwell asked Elena with surprising gentleness. Yes, thank you. This guard, he saved me. I was so frightened and he helped me when no one else was around. Commander Hartwell studied both David and Elena for a long moment. The wheels of protocol and human decency turned visibly in her mind as she weighed duty against compassion, regulations against results. Sergeant Thompson, she said finally, escort this young lady back to the main building and ensure she reaches her security detail safely. Then return to your post. As David walked Elena back toward the palace, she squeezed his arm gratefully. Thank you for breaking your rules for me. Thank you for reminding me why those rules exist in the first place, David replied. To protect people. Sometimes we just have to remember who we're really serving. The transformation within the Royal Guard was becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as isolated incidents of compassion was evolving into something much larger. A cultural shift that was challenging centuries of tradition. Commander Hartwell found herself at the center of discussions that reached the highest levels of government, and even the royal family itself. Private Rebecca. Walsh was acutely aware of the changes happening around her. As one of the newer members of the Guard, having joined just 18 months earlier, she had witnessed the entire evolution firsthand. The stories of Marcus, Sarah, James, and David had become legendary among the Guards, whispered about during shift changes and debated during off-duty hours. Rebecca came from a family of teachers and social workers, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. Joining the Royal Guard had seemed like a way to serve her country, while maintaining that family tradition of service. But the strict protocols had sometimes made her question whether she was truly making a difference in the world. On a crisp autumn evening, Rebecca was assigned to the evening watch at the South Gate, a position that typically saw fewer tourists but occasionally hosted special events and ceremonies. The day had been quiet, with only a handful of visitors taking photographs and admiring the palace architecture as the sun began to set. As darkness approached, Rebecca noticed something unusual. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, had been sitting on a bench across from the gate for over 2 hours. Unlike typical tourists, she wasn't taking photos or admiring the surroundings. Instead, she seemed lost in thought, occasionally writing in a small journal and frequently wiping tears from her eyes. The woman was dressed professionally but appeared disheveled, as if she had been traveling or under significant stress. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she clutched a small backpack as if it contained everything she owned. Every few minutes, she would look up at the palace, then back at her journal, as if making some kind of decision. As the evening grew colder and the tourist area began to empty, Rebecca became increasingly concerned. The young woman showed no signs of leaving, despite the dropping temperature and the fact that she was wearing only a light jacket. More troubling, Rebecca observed behavior that suggested the woman might be contemplating something serious and irreversible. During her training, Rebecca had learned to recognize signs of someone in severe emotional distress, and everything about this woman's demeanor raised alarm bells. The way she kept writing and then tearing up pages from her journal, the manner in which she stared at the palace as if seeking some kind of answer or resolution, and most concerning of all, the fact that she had placed what appeared to be a small pile of personal belongings beside her on the bench. Rebecca had heard stories from veteran guards about people who came to the palace during their darkest moments, drawn by the stability and permanence the institution represented. Some came seeking help, others seeking a meaningful place to make a final statement. The thought that this young woman might be contemplating self-harm made Rebecca's heart race with urgency. As the last tourist departed and the area grew quiet, Rebecca faced a decision that went far beyond the previous instances of guards breaking protocol. This wasn't about helping someone with medication or comforting a sick child. This was potentially about saving someone's life. The woman stood up from the bench and walked closer to the gate, stopping just outside the barriers. She pulled out her journal one more time and began writing what appeared to be a longer message. Her tears fell more freely now, and Rebecca could see her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I don't know if anyone can hear me," the woman said softly, speaking toward Rebecca's position. "But I wanted to come somewhere that represented stability and honor before I make my final decision." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to reach out to this desperate young person who was clearly contemplating ending her life. The protocols about maintaining position and not engaging with the public seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of preventing a tragedy. "I lost my job last month," the woman continued, her voice barely audible. "My apartment, my savings, everything. My family disowned me when I came out as gay. I have nowhere to go, no one who cares if I exist or not. I thought maybe if I came here, to a place that represents something permanent and meaningful, I could find some reason to keep going." Rebecca's heart broke at the raw pain in the young woman's voice. She thought about her own family, about the unconditional love and support that had always been available to her, about the safety net that had allowed her to take risks and pursue her dreams. This woman had none of that, was facing the world completely alone. The woman sat back down on the bench and pulled a small bottle from her backpack, confirming Rebecca's worst fears. She was looking at pills, counting them, preparing to take a step that couldn't be undone. In that moment, Rebecca knew that no regulation, no protocol, no threat of discipline could stop her from acting. She stepped away from her post and walked directly toward the woman, her boots echoing loudly on the cobblestones in the quiet evening air. "Excuse me," Rebecca called out gently, causing the woman to look up in surprise. "I know I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I couldn't stand by and watch you hurt yourself." The woman's eyes widened in shock. You're supposed to be like a statue. I thought you couldn't move or speak." "We're human beings first," Rebecca replied, sitting down on the bench beside the young woman. "And right now, being human means making sure you're okay. What's your name?" "Jennifer," the woman whispered, still clutching the bottle of pills. "I'm Jennifer. Jennifer, I'm Rebecca. I know we just met, but I want you to know that I care whether you exist or not. The world needs people like you, people who are brave enough to be authentic even when it costs them everything." Over the next hour, Rebecca sat with Jennifer listening to her story, offering comfort and hope, and most importantly, helping her see that her current situation, however desperate, was temporary and changeable. Rebecca shared resources for housing assistance, job placement services, and LGBTQ+ support groups, writing them down on paper torn from Jennifer's journal. By the time Rebecca's replacement arrived for the next shift, Jennifer had agreed to spend the night at a crisis center and begin working with counselors to rebuild her life. The bottle of pills had been safely disposed of, and Jennifer was looking toward the future instead of planning to end it. As Rebecca walked Jennifer to meet the crisis counselor, who had arrived to help transport her to safety, Jennifer squeezed her hand tightly. "You saved my life tonight," Jennifer said simply. "I came here planning to die, and instead I found someone who reminded me that I deserve to live." "Everyone deserves to live," Rebecca replied. "And everyone deserves to have someone who notices when they're in pain. I'm just glad I was here when you needed help." The security footage of that evening would become part of a growing file that was making its way through government channels, reaching decision-makers who were beginning to understand that something extraordinary was happening within the Royal Guard. These weren't isolated incidents of rule-breaking, but rather evidence of a group of people who understood the true meaning of service and protection. 6 months had passed since Marcus first accepted a tissue from little Sophie, and the Royal Guard had become the subject of international fascination. News crews from around the world had documented what journalists were calling the revolution of compassion, and the Palace had received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories of kindness and requesting visits from the human guards. Commander Hartwell stood in her office, looking out at the courtyard where crowds had gathered larger than ever before. But these weren't typical tourists seeking photo opportunities with motionless sentries. These were people who came hoping to witness acts of kindness, families bringing children to learn about compassion, and individuals seeking connection with guards who had proven that duty and humanity could coexist beautifully. The file on her desk contained reports from all the protocol-breaking incidents, along with something unprecedented, a direct communication from the royal family expressing not condemnation, but gratitude for the guards who had remembered that serving the crown means serving the people with both strength and compassion. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Several veteran officers had requested transfers, unable to adapt to what they saw as a dangerous erosion of discipline. But for every officer who left, 2 more requested to join the Royal Guard, drawn by the opportunity to serve in a unit that valued both duty and humanity. Marcus Wellington, now promoted to senior captain, stood at his familiar post at the main gate. But everything about his role had changed. The rigid silence of the past had been replaced by what officials called compassionate vigilance, allowing guards to respond to genuine human need while maintaining their ceremonial duties. The morning brought a familiar sight that had become increasingly common. A school group approached, but unlike the children of the past who tried to make the guards laugh or break character, these students came with handmade cards and small gifts for the guards who had become famous for their kindness. Among the children, Marcus spotted a familiar face that made his heart swell with joy. Sophie, now 8 years old and taller, walked hand in hand with her grandmother toward the gate. The little girl who had started everything wore the same bright smile, but now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she had changed the world in a small but meaningful way. "Grandmama, there's the guardman who took my tissue," Sophie exclaimed, pointing toward Marcus with excitement. Her grandmother smiled, her eyes twinkling with recognition. "Yes, dear. That's Captain Marcus. He's become quite famous because of your kindness." Sophie approached the gate with the same innocent confidence she had shown months earlier. But this time, instead of offering a tissue for tears, she carried a small wrapped package and a letter written in her careful child's handwriting. "Hello, Mr. Guard Captain," she said formally, having learned proper titles from her grandmother. "I brought you something special." Marcus, no longer bound by the old restrictions, smiled warmly at the child who had started his journey toward understanding the true meaning of service. "Hello, Sophie. It's wonderful to see you again." Sophie beamed at being remembered and carefully unwrapped her package to reveal a hand-painted picture frame containing a photograph. The image showed Marcus accepting her tissue that first day, but someone had added colorful drawings around the edges depicting other guards helping people, creating a beautiful collage of compassion. "My teacher helped me make this," Sophie explained proudly. "She said you and the other guards are heroes because you help people when they're sad or scared or sick." Marcus knelt down to Sophie's level, accepting the gift with genuine gratitude. "This is beautiful, Sophie. Thank you for thinking of us. I also wrote you a letter," Sophie continued, handing him the carefully folded paper. "Do you want me to read it to you?" "I would be honored," Marcus replied. Sophie cleared her throat importantly and began to read in her clear young voice. "Dear Guard Captain Marcus and all the Royal Guards, thank you for being kind to people. My grandmama says that being strong and being nice at the same time is very hard, but you do it every day. You helped me when I was worried about you being sad, and now I know that even big, strong guards need hugs and tissues sometimes. I hope you keep helping people because it makes everyone happy. Love, Sophie. P.S. I still have more rainbow stickers if you need them." The crowd that had gathered to listen broke into gentle applause, many wiping tears from their eyes at the simple wisdom of a child's words. Marcus felt his own eyes moisten as he carefully folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket. "Sophie," Marcus said seriously, "would you like to know a secret?" The little girl nodded eagerly. "That day when you gave me the tissue, I was very sad because my own daughter was sick and far away. Your kindness helped me remember that there are good people in the world who care about others, even strangers. Because of you, I became a better guard and a better father." Sophie's eyes widened with wonder. "Is your daughter better now?" "She is," Marcus replied, his voice filled with emotion. "The doctors helped her get well, and she's going to visit here next month. I can't wait for you to meet her." As the school group prepared to continue their tour, Sophie's grandmother approached Marcus with her own gift, a small photo album filled with pictures from that first day, including images she had taken of the crowd's reaction to his act of kindness. "I thought you might like to have these," she said softly. "That day you didn't just help my granddaughter feel better about seeing you cry. You showed everyone watching that strength and compassion aren't opposites, they're partners." Throughout the courtyard, similar scenes were playing out. Sarah Chen was speaking with a group of military veterans, sharing stories about service and sacrifice. James Mitchell was helping a young boy in a wheelchair get the perfect photograph with the palace in the background. David Thompson was teaching a class of students about the history of the Royal Guard while emphasizing the importance of protecting others. Through both strength and kindness, Rebecca Walsh had become something of a celebrity after her intervention with Jennifer, who had since found stable housing and employment and had become a volunteer with crisis intervention programs. The two had remained friends, and Jennifer often visited the palace to volunteer with tour groups, sharing her story of how a guard's compassion had literally saved her life. As the day progressed, Commander Hartwell made her rounds, observing the interactions between her guards and the public. What she saw filled her with pride and convinced her that the changes implemented over the past months had not weakened the Royal Guard but had, instead, revealed its true strength. The guards still maintained their ceremonial duties with precision and dignity. They still represented centuries of tradition and honor. But now they also embodied something even more valuable: the understanding that true service means recognizing the humanity in everyone they encounter. As the sun began to set over the palace, Marcus looked at the rainbow sticker that Sophie had given him all those months ago, now carefully preserved in his locker alongside her letter and photograph. Around him, his fellow guards continued their duties, but the atmosphere was different now. The rigid silence had been replaced by purposeful vigilance, the cold formality softened by genuine care for the people they served. The transformation of the Royal Guard had proven that tradition and compassion weren't enemies, but could work together to create something beautiful and meaningful. 50 times guards had broken protocol, and 50 times they had discovered that sometimes the most important rule is the one that tells us to help others when they need it most. In the months that followed, the Royal Guard would become a model studied by military and ceremonial units around the world. But for Marcus, Sarah, James, David, Rebecca, and all their colleagues, the real measure of their success wasn't found in textbooks or training manuals. It was found in the smiles of children like Sophie, the gratitude of people like Jennifer, and the knowledge that they had learned to serve not just with discipline and honor, but with hearts full of compassion for their fellow human beings. The revolution of kindness that began with a small girl's tissue had grown into something that would define the Royal Guard for generations to come, proving that the strongest guards are those who know when to stand firm and when to kneel down to help someone in need.